Good morning. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. My name is Julie Morgan, and on behalf of CAP's post-secondary education team, I'd like to thank you for joining here to discuss or mark the release of Anya Kamenetz's new ebook, The Edupunks Guide. These days, as we so often hear, non-traditional is becoming the new traditional in higher education. More than half of all students are financially independent. Many attend college part-time, work full-time, or have dependents other than a spouse. CAP's post-secondary work is premised on the idea that students who approach college in a non-traditional way cannot be fully served by an educational system that is mired in tradition. In our paper, Disrupting College, Clayton Christensen argues that the future of higher education will be dominated by institutions that organize themselves around their students' needs, rather than being constrained by the way things have always been done. Like her previous book, DIYU, Anya's Edupunks Guide recognizes that students' needs have changed. She describes a group of students who are not waiting for colleges to catch up. They're taking matters into their own hands, developing new pathways to post-secondary education. Anya's guide gives the students the tools they need to pursue higher education in ways that are money-saving, that are flexible, and that are attuned to the reality that post-secondary learning will be a lifelong process for the coming generations of students. We're very pleased to have with us today Suzanne Walsh, who's going to give some opening remarks for us. Suzanne is a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she leads the foundation's developmental education and new model strategies. Prior to joining Gates, Suzanne also worked at the Lumina Foundation in Indianapolis and the Himes Endowments in Pittsburgh. Welcome, Suzanne.
Good morning. It is really just an honor to be here, so thank you to the Center for American Progress for hosting this. And really just sort of an interesting opportunity for us to reflect on the future of education. And I wanted to put it in a little bit of context. First, what does the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation care about this issue? But then also just to sort of challenge us to think beyond maybe the paper that we've read before, as well as thinking about Anya's latest book, sort of where do those things lead us? First of all, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, if you listen to NPR, you know that we believe that everybody deserves an opportunity to lead a healthy and productive life. We also believe that education provides a pathway to possibilities. So this is how we got into this space. And as we think about those pathways to possibilities, one of the challenges is one size does not fit all. And we know that. We keep hearing that over and over again. And yet I think the challenge is, when will we actually see a change? When will we see somebody really sort of react to that? At the foundation, we think about both working internally with existing institutions. Are there ways that we can help them to innovate, as well as working on new models? And so this is part of what led us to this work with DIYU and with the Edupunks Guide. But as we think about those alternative delivery models, there are sort of three areas that we are particularly interested in. One is around diagnostic assessments. You know, it doesn't sound super sexy and exciting at this hour, but it is. And maybe this hour, sorry, I'm still on Pacific time, so it's super early for me. But diagnostic assessments are really important in identifying where students are at the moment and where we are sort of trying to get them. So diagnostic assessments is an area that we are really looking at in this sort of emerging world of alternative delivery models. But we also are interested in diagnostic assessments in terms of their role in existing institutions. We're also really interested in learner relationship management, or for those of you who are from the corporate world, it's customer relationship management. So important when you think about how we manage a student's life while they're in higher education. It's important for the student and it's important for the institution. And finally, courseware. And you've probably heard quite a bit in terms of some of the areas that we've invested in. Sol Khan's Khan Academy is one of the areas that comes to mind quickly. But those are the things that we are really thinking about in terms of what's sort of the future of higher education. And Louis had asked me to not just talk about where our investments are at the foundation, but also just to talk about what my perspective is and what have I been thinking about in this space. The first thing that I really spend a lot of time thinking about is that we have not realized the promise of technology in education. We keep hearing about it, we keep hearing it's going to do all of these great things, but we're not quite there. There's a great promise there, but we haven't quite reached that or realized that promise. So therefore, we are due for disruption. And what does that disruption look like? It is a significant change in the way that we do business in higher education and the way that the student is able to approach our institutions of higher education. I'm also really curious about all of the people who are thinking about the kinds of things that Anya talks about in the Edupunks guide. So what are the ways that people are either disrupting from within or trying to find alternative models to sort of get around the system? So Dale Doherty, who is at Make Magazine, one of the things that I love about Dale is he has this idea about what would happen if we had an open table kind of app for learning. So in other words, if I'm teaching something in my neighborhood, you could sign up and make a reservation to come and to learn with me. It could be guitar, it could be Spanish, it could be math. The possibilities are endless. But just thinking about there are ways that people in your neighborhood can contribute to being part of your personal learning network. The other thing that is really interesting, and I've been thinking about this for probably about 4 years, and that is the idea of university, spelled U-N-I-V-E-R, city, C-I-T-Y. How do you think about cities really being the university? If I go to the museum, just as someone sort of on the weekend, there are a ton of things that I've learned. There are a ton of things that if I come to a CAP session, most of you will leave with some nuggets. But what does that do? Why can't that be part of what I've learned? Why can't that be part of a portfolio that says, I actually learned a lot when I went to CAP, or I learned a lot when I went to the Smithsonian, and here's what I learned. And be able to use that in sort of in life as opposed to just having those opportunities as just sort of things that you do on the side. They really are part of lifelong learning. The future, I think, really is about, I had mentioned personal learning networks. Absolutely critical, and Anya talks about them in her guide. When I think about them, however, it's not so easy. It's not just as simple to say, oh, we should all have a personal learning network. I'm just going to network with these folks because they're interested in the things that I'm interested in. It's a commitment on both sides, and I think people don't often realize that. It's sort of like mentoring. How many of you have ever signed up to be a mentor? Was that a lot of work or what? Woo! I mean, it sounds fantastic. But you really have to, when you think about these ideas, think about it as a two-way street. How much work is it on both sides? But it's really worth it. I think about the young people that have me in their personal learning networks, and it is a lot of work. They ask a lot of me, but I learn along with them, and I think that that's what's also really compelling about those. I also get the sense from them often that they've learned the most from the people in their personal learning network, even beyond what they've learned in the classroom. The other thing that I think a lot about is the importance of curating your learning. So I said, if I go to Smithsonian, if I come to CAP, why can't I somehow capture that knowledge and share it with others, but also somehow signify that I have done this learning, that I have attended these things? Nobody has figured this out. I don't think they figured. Oh, look! I just saw Kevin Carey's head snap up. He has an idea, but I'm not sure that we've really figured out what curation means and how to do it effectively. I think people are experimenting, but I'm not sure that we've really figured it out. The other thing is we need to decide, when does place matter? So it's not just that technology is the solution for everything, and I love technology. I love all the latest gadgets, but it's not always the first stop. And so there are things to think about, like, what do we do with empty movie theaters during the day? Why can't we stream videos to the movie theater? And if I know that I need math, if I need help with fractions, and I know the fractions lecture is going to be at 1 p.m., I could go to the museum, I've got the museum on my mind. I could go to the movie theater and attend that lecture. There are lots of ways that we can think about using existing institutions in the community to participate in our learning when we know that place matters so often. And that the importance of place is also community. You can get a community online, but sometimes you just need to meet in person. Why are we all here together? We could have all watched online. There's something about being together that's important, and understanding when that's appropriate and when you don't need it is important. The last thing is, how do we build on existing platforms? And so, this is the thing where students come to institutions already using Facebook. It's not news probably for many of you, but for many institutions, it's news. Students are already using Facebook, they're already using Twitter, they're already using a variety of things. Why can't we just integrate that into our educational system? Why do we constantly feel a need to create yet another platform, to create yet another application? There are ways that we can build on that. And I think this is really where there are so many great ideas. There are so many things that I think people, especially from outside of higher education, are bringing, but there are two things that are missing. So all of my aspirations for learning from the museum and learning when I go to CAP, the challenge is that the accreditation system of higher ed doesn't actually support that. So how do we rethink accreditation? Is it that we no longer accredit institutions? Maybe we accredit individuals? I don't know what the answer is, but we need to rethink it. And certification is important. You have to have a way of showing that you have learned something. How do you show that you have learned something when you've attended a CAP session? So I just have a final few thoughts. I think that this Edupunks guide discussion is a great follow-on to the Disrupting College conversation. And I think that it's so important for a few reasons. Number one is that I think it can challenge us to think about how do you measure success differently. So learning is not just signified by a degree. There are other ways to say, I have learned something. And so how many of you have seen Moneyball? Right? Is every speaker now saying, let's use Moneyball as an example of how to rethink measurement? I don't know. I keep using it over and over again, so I think other people must be as well. But, the gist of that was they really thought about how do we think about measuring success and anticipating success in a different way. What's the Moneyball version in the higher ed space? Or what's the healthcare equivalent of moving from managing illness to managing wellness? So measurement of success, I think, is important. How do we eliminate, ultimately, this is really about how do we eliminate barriers for disruption in order to provide better opportunities for students? We really, at the foundation, see this kind of work, see the sort of work that you've been talking about in terms of disrupting college, in terms of the Edupunks Guide, as providing those critical alternative pathways to possibility. So thank you so much for having us, and I'm really excited to turn it over to Anya.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. No, that's totally fine, but I have to apologize because we've had a little bit of a tech issue. So the slides will be up on the TVs to the left, and you'll just have to say next when you want them to change the slide. So I'd like to take responsibility for that.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for coming. In case Suzanne kind of glossed over this, but the Edupunks Guide exists because of her personal championship and support. So I just, really want to express my gratitude for that. Not to mention, the Gates Foundation. And I am completely honored, not to say humbled, to be here and to have you all here to celebrate the launch of an ebook. Who would have thought that that would actually lead to something such as people gathering in a room together? It's kind of an amazing thing to have happen. But, and I think, are there paper copies of the book? There were supposed to, but you can download it from Scribd, and you can download it, and the new website is just up with all the content from the guide, edupunksguide.org. So you can surf there from your phone right now and surf through the guide and check it out, and I hope that you will. I can't see my slides, so I'm just not going to worry about them, and I'm going to just talk for a little bit. There is a young man named Mateus Lelis, and he was born in Brazil, and he grew up in Massachusetts, and he has immigration status issues which prevent him from getting a Pell Grant to go to college. And in fact, he's sort of caught in a loophole where it's actually even difficult for him to enroll as a credits-based student because he's neither an international student nor a green card student. So normally in most eras, this would lead to Mateus really abandoning his education before it began, even though he was an honor student in high school. But today, Mateus's future looks very different because He decided to enroll in computer science classes at Bristol Community College, continuing education-based classes. And at the same time, he started to take advantage of the kind of courses that are available for free online. So he started following a professor at Harvard, a computer science professor, who puts all of his lectures online independently of Harvard. And he got very, very into programming. He got really excited about it. And he actually prefers the lectures that he can see online because he can pause it, he can follow what the teacher's doing, follow along. If he has a question, he can go and Google it and see other resources and then come back to what the teacher's saying. So he got more and more advanced in his computer science studies, and he started a correspondence with this professor, which led to now him actually traveling up to Cambridge on the train a few times a week to audit classes by this professor at Harvard. So there are a lot of people like Mateus out there who have the ability to benefit from higher education, but for material reasons or technical reasons don't have the resources. And those are the people that I call Edupunks. I'm deliberately appropriating and widening the focus of what I call an edupunk, because I think there are a lot of people out there that do not fit the old college mold, and it's actually the majority of people that don't fit the old college mold. And by calling them edupunks, we're repurposing that experience from something where they're not good enough or they don't measure up to something where they are independent, they are different, they are challengers, and they really are a challenge to the system as it exists, because these are the people who are going to create and constitute our future. And if the existing systems can't accommodate them, that potential is going to be lost. So what's to be done? We know that we have these great technologies, we have all these new ideas. What does it mean to chart the Edupunks' way forward to get a DIY credential or a DIY education? Well, so, there's 44 million students in America, for example, that have some college and no degree. And that is an incredible sunk cost, an incredible opportunity cost, a wasted investment of time, both by the system and by those individuals. And all of these learners are pursuing individual paths, some of them more by choice and some of them more by circumstance, and they have a wide variety of abilities that they're bringing to the table. And so DIY is really about people making do with what they have. So the reason that I wrote the Edupunks Guide is to create a breadcrumb trail from the existing world of free content, open resources, open platforms for interaction. This is, a very, very, very big part of the educational process, is interacting with peers, interacting with teachers, with others who have superior knowledge maybe in one particular area. So online forums where people are asking questions and helping each other out with problems. So the open content, the resources, the platforms, and then the accreditation. And this accreditation infrastructure, I think, is emerging. I think it's actually out there. I think the seeds of it are something that we can see. And some examples that I like to talk about that I talk about in the guide to help to point people toward have been in place for a long time. I mean, a lot of them date back to the 1970s. We've got a national system of credit by exam, the ACE credit recommendation system, where you can take, you can gain the knowledge anywhere and take that exam and get a college credit that's accepted nominally by thousands of schools. We have a national credit by portfolio system. LearningCounts.org launched just this spring, where people can take the learning that they've done through vocational training, through military training, through lifelong learning experiences, and translate that into a narrative with documentation. And it's not an easy process. It's actually a quite difficult and qualitative process to, again, get college credit for the learning that they're doing, whether that's happening in open networks or anywhere throughout their life. And then finally, we have these emerging systems of portfolios, of badges. And badges are systems that, was announced 2 weeks ago at the Digital Media and Learning Competition of the MacArthur Foundation, that any institution, any organization that teaches, and Center for American Progress could be one of these, create a system of badges to certify learning in a way that's modular, that is verifiable by a network, that is up to date, so very, very tied to the changing needs for people's skills and demand for skills. And so this is a way to have a kind of portable accreditation system that people can take with them throughout their lives. And so all of these are pieces of the puzzle: credit by portfolio, credit by badge, credit by exam. And then colleges that accommodate people who are designing their own individualized learning plans in this way, again, date back to the 1970s. There are public universities across the country that specialize in doing this. There are only a few. They have small enrollments. They have small numbers of students that actually take advantage of this. But I believe that the potential is actually really enormous. I think that between the systems like the MIT OpenCourseWare, which has 100 million users, Sal Khan, which has millions of users, the Khan Academy, and these ways of validating and accrediting these systems, which have users in the teens, in the 20s, in the hundreds, and the thousands, I think there are very large untapped potential for students to create these kinds of paths to get their own credentials and to certify the learning that's already going on, to certify the learning that may be outdated, that they've taken, college credits in years past. And, I wrote the guide as a breadcrumb trail, as I mentioned, for students who, to be able to take these ingredients right now. And there are a lot of students like Mateos that are already doing this. And I also wrote it for institutions to show them what's missing. And a lot of times what's missing is just to communicate about the options that are available out there. Students only hear about one way to success. They only hear about one path. Very often, when they say college, they only think of a 4-year residential program. And they think if they can't do that, then they're not college material or they're not good enough. And what the Edupunks Guide is really written to show is that there are many, many ways out there. The solution does not hold in one silver bullet technology or one silver bullet transformation, but it holds in a diversity of options, a diversity of resources. That's the only way that we're going to meet the demands for education that are out there. So I'm really, really excited to be a part of imagining solutions for students. And I think that the opportunities that are already existing in the form of what you can read about in the Edupunks Guide and the many, many stories that I've gathered of students that are pursuing this kind of learning already are inspiring, and they show you what could be in the way forward. And so, rather than talk about, I think a lot of times when people get together in the education space, they talk about problems, they talk about challenges. So I'm excited to be here today to try to start a conversation about potential solutions. Thanks a lot.
I'm just going to invite our panelists to come up, Anya and our front row guests, and I'll give a little brief overview of who we have here with us today. So from my right to left, I hope I get that right. That would be awfully embarrassing. We have Peter Smith, who's the Senior Vice President of Academic Strategies and Development for Kaplan Higher Education. Peter has experience working at many levels of higher education, including as Assistant Director of UNESCO, the founding President of the California State University at Monterey Bay, and as the first President of the statewide Community College of Vermont. We have Phil Auerswald, who's a senior fellow at the Kauffman Foundation and an associate professor of public policy at George Mason University. He's also the co-founder and co-editor of Innovations, Technology, Governance, and Globalization, a quarterly journal from MIT Press, and author of numerous books and reports and all kinds of things. And we have Michael Edson, who's the Director of Web and New Media Strategy at the Smithsonian Institution, and hopefully throughout the panel you'll tell us a little bit more about what that means. He developed Smithsonian's first web and new media strategy, which is called the Smithsonian Commons Concept, and its first blog as well. And Michael's been involved in many aspects of technology and new media for museums. And of course we have Anya. So, as I read through the Edupunks Guide, it sort of struck me that, it's broadly applicable. It applies to everything from, a 20-year-old who's looking at getting their first post-secondary credential to somebody like me. I was surprised to see things in there that I could apply to myself, but, somebody who has several post-secondary degrees, maybe too many, but might want a little bit more extra learning in a certain area to help them get to their next job. But at the same time, there are plenty of students who would never know that this alternative path to a credential exists, or people like me who might never think that they could get that additional learning without applying to a traditional university and paying that, the hefty tuition. So my question for the panel is, should more people be considering a DIY approach to education?
The thing, I think this is Anya she is more right in her analysis than she may understand even, and I'm not qualifying your understanding at all. We've known for almost 50 years that the average adult in America, Africa, Canada spends about 800 hours a year. So just divide that by 50. There's really 52 weeks in a year, and you get a number in informal, personal learning. They set their own goals. They find the resources they need. They learn until they're satisfied, and then they stop. When questioned, and there's an enormous amount, it's called self-directed learning, a lot of research on it, they then forget what they learned. It's in there, it's tacit, it's affecting their behavior, it's affecting their skills, it's affecting everything, but they are not conscious that they have it. And so what I've been thinking about for 40 some odd years is, how do you pull that learning back out, get people to look at it, think about it, and build on it. And what we find, and I was one of the founders of CALE, so I'm a big Learning Counts fan, and I'm a big CALE fan. And we've got a similar program at Kaplan that I've created where people can come anytime and get assessed with third-party validation of that assessment. Because once you do that, all the data shows that they become much more purposeful, self-focused learners. They do a better job. And so it's the right question, but I would argue it's not perhaps phrased correctly, because everybody is a DIY learner, including every one of us. And the question is, as I think Anya has said very well, how do you capture it? How do you understand it? How do you reflect on it? How do you use it to work for you? And I would suggest, by definition, the people in this room are much better at doing that than many of the people. And the real question is, how do you connect with people who have been systematically marginalized in their lives, economically, socially, and civically, and use this powerful learning to bring them to the mainstream, or what I call the table of opportunity.
Anybody else want to?
Well, I'm mulling that over from the point of view of someone who works in a big institution, who has resources. I mean, our mission at the Smithsonian is literally the increase and diffusion of knowledge. We spend a lot of money every year to make that happen. And from an institutional point of view, how can we invest that money wisely to make more learning happen in a more effective way? We're at the Smithsonian now, we're focused on 4 grand challenges, highly relevant social challenges. Unlocking the mysteries of the universe, understanding and sustaining a biodiverse planet, valuing world cultures, and understanding the American experience. How can we reorient? How can we orient ourselves away from thinking that we're going to produce the learning associated with those goals ourselves, much in the same way a university would say, perhaps, the learning around those goals is going to happen within our hallowed walls, our ivy-covered walls, toward a stance where we're a catalyst, and we're actually helping not only direct to consumer, kind of a crass term, direct to learner maybe is better, but helping agents who are already in powerful positions between learners and goals.
It's interesting because I think that you guys are touching on one of the sort of themes of the Edupunks guide, but also DOIU, the separation of learning from the credentialing. So what you're doing at Smithsonian is primarily helping people learn, right?
Or I would even say we're trying to help people solve problems or do difficult work. One of those things is learning. At a certain point, learning is inseparable from accomplishment. Learning can be driven by pursuit of hairy goals, audacious goals. So it's really in that mixing bowl that we're trying to be successful.
And it's not just learning, but it's also, it's knowledge production. I mean, there's a tense relationship between learning and accreditation, because accreditation is this external little fillip that you put on at the end, but really, you know, yeah, in an idealized learning process, you have an internal sense of accomplishment, and you also have ability to something that I talk about in the guide, which is another level of assessment, which is the ability to prove what you've done to a network of practitioners who, let's face it, after your first job, don't really care what your GPA was, and after your second job, hopefully, they don't even care what name is on the top of your transcript. They care what you can do. And, you know, that's how the real world identifies accomplishment. And, and the analogous kind of path in the world of learning is, at some point in the discussion basis, you know, the student surpasses the master, and we move from learning to knowledge production. And that's the kind of, you know, cultural level process that we're trying to facilitate here, and that institutions like Smithsonian are trying to do, right?
So in the book, you mentioned some ways for students to prove their knowledge, but there's also a lot of ways to get a credential for learning that you've accrued in other ways. So there is this sort of emphasis for some areas of study. A credential is what you need to get yourself into the job market, at least in the beginning. So, do you see that as something that will be changing, or will the Edupunk always need to get that credential from an accredited institution?
Well, no, I mean, I'm very interested in this question of what universities fundamentally do and what the market for that service is in the future. So the way I look at it, there's basically learning, access to networks, and the credential. Okay, and they can be separated. The learning we've talked about. Access to networks, I have taught at universities. I'm at a great place, George Mason University. I have a sort of global network of contacts that I value. And yet Twitter, for me, is a hugely valuable resource. When I first found out about DIYU, I happened to be in a bookstore, a coffee shop. I went upstairs, got a copy of the book. That was within 5 minutes of seeing it online. Glanced through it, thought Anya is going to be perfect for this event that I happened to be organizing at that time at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. Messaged her, got a message back. She was confirmed on my panel within an hour of my first seeing her book online. Right? And now we're, I would say, friends, colleagues, valued part of my personal network.
And that's how I met Anya also.
Right. So in other words, this isn't just for peripheral people who can't find their way in. This is for everybody, and absolutely including me. So access to networks, students have different places to go. So then it's really the credential, right? The ability that sort of university's monopoly on the first is diminishing. So what about the credential? The credential isn't something that the student actually consumes. The student buys the credential and then resells it in another market. They resell the credential to an employer. So from my standpoint, what's really interesting isn't the desirability of the trends that we're discussing. It's actually their inevitability. And you see that on the employer side. So from employer standpoint then, flip the perspective now. Think about it from the standpoint of the purchaser of the credential. There's one thing we know about global corporations that are dominant buyers in the labor market. They're competing for talent. They're competing for talent globally. There's a skills mismatch issue. The people who are unemployed aren't the people that corporations want to hire. That means that it is a first order survival imperative for corporations to find the best people wherever they are. Credentials aren't doing it. And you talked about Moneyball. It is back to Moneyball, because essentially corporations have already started to figure out in a very systematic way how to find the talent wherever it is. They don't know what the universities in Brazil are. They don't know what the universities in India are. So the systems are already in place to do that. And all of this informal credentialing, all of the stack certificates, all of this ability to directly assess capabilities is something that corporations are in the process of doing. My last comment on that is to say that this isn't some sort of over-the-horizon thing. Infosys runs a campus that has 30,000 students. And every employee at Infosys goes through a 12 to 14-week intensive course, essentially. It's a degree. It's a mini degree. And they don't look at degrees. There's so much degree fraud in India that they just throw their resumes right into the recycling. and they just go directly to assessment of people's capabilities. Once that happens, once those systems are in place to directly assess capabilities, demand for credentials can fall off as rapidly as demand for print newspapers did. And universities aren't ready for that.
Yeah, you're describing what I would phrase the mother of all mashups, because universities aren't ready for it, and in fact are organized fundamentally in the other direction. They see their job as the creation of knowledge, the anticipation of what it is people need to know, the validation that people have gone through it, so on and so forth. We all know that story. And it strikes me, I mean, all you have to do is think about a Cisco certificate. I don't know of a business that wouldn't take a Cisco certificate as an absolute indicator of what it is that a person knew, and they would, regardless of where they went to college or did not. I think the thing that is, and I think this revel is funny, I finished Harnessing America's Wasted Talent, and I called it A New Ecology of Learning. It was about 17 months ago, and in fact, this conversation was almost like the same month as DIY. This conversation wouldn't have happened 24 months ago. Wouldn't have happened with the clarity. And I can tell you, like I just discovered a diagnostic software that will point and shoot at a job and a job description, and then point and shoot at an employee doing the job and create a gap analysis, not only on the hard skills, but the soft skills and behavioral skills, the cognitive analytical skills needed to do the job better, so that you can then create a curriculum, or the individual can know what they need to do next in order to become more capable and go do it. Now, holy moly. So the fact is that it is going to be, and this at a time when universities are caught in this iron economic triangle. I just spent a week in California. My God, I'm glad I was at Cal State Monterey Bay from 95 to 05. Because it is a tough situation out there.
Okay, I just want to push back just a little bit on what you guys are saying. I believe it. I totally believe it. And I've spoken to people from places like Microsoft where they say, degrees don't matter. We've developed our own assessments of competency, and that's what matters to us. But what about smaller businesses? What's the future for those businesses that also care more about competency than about credential, but that can't develop their own systems of evaluation?
Well, not all jobs are created equal, and not all businesses are the same kinds of businesses. And in listening to Peter, Phil, and Anya talk, and Suzanne's remarks at the beginning, it occurs, I'm thinking of Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk, Does Creativity Kill Education? And with all these smart people in the room, his assertion that we don't know what the future is going to look like 5 years from now, let alone 30 or 40 years from now. The idea that learning and I'll put credentialing aside, but learning must stop, learning can stop after you receive your degree is insane. The profession that I'm in, such as it is, didn't exist when I was in college. That's going to accelerate for reasons Peter touched on very clearly. You're gesturing like the smart person who needs to talk. No.
Oh, well, just to follow on what you said, Kathy Davidson in her new book, Now You See It, cites estimates that 58% of grade school students will be employed in careers that don't exist. And the fact of the matter is that, looking to get hired by a company, we were just talking about this backstage, is not the success strategy of the 21st century. Even a great big company like Infosys, Infosys engineers get paid $13,000 a year. They're in India, right? So students need to not only become qualified, but they need to qualify themselves to create jobs, to create opportunities, to create those small businesses. You're not really looking to be hired by a small business, you're looking to create a small business. And there's such a big divide between the students at the fringes who are being marketed the little credentials that are out there, like to become a certified medical assistant, to become a billing person, a cog in a health insurance machine that's going to be eliminated with the stroke of the pen, at the next round of healthcare reform. Is that the kind of system that we want to prepare people to enter? Or do we want to create a system that's a little bit more flexible, that's a little bit more based on individual competencies and a self-directed knowledge style and learning style that actually is going to enable them to do the things that they need to do?
Or both.
Yeah.
Being at the Kauffman Foundation of the Foundation of Entrepreneurship, I have to endorse this point that the students should be prepared to make a job, not take a job. So that's one issue. But I think another point that's important to get on the table, and that we just haven't mentioned, although I think we're all in agreement with it. People who are new to this topic, they come into a room and their mental model of university is, well, maybe not MIT and Harvard, but it's certainly University of Wisconsin, maybe even George Mason. All right, George Mason is kind of on the cusp, but we're not talking about any of the universities that have flashed through your mind as we've been having this conversation. That the Ivy Leagues educate 0.5% of all students in the United States that are in college. So that's not the conversation we're having. And when we talk about degrees won't matter, we're not talking about MIT degrees. The issue of sort of should more people be taking advantage of online learning. It's sort of like saying, back in like 2002, should more people be watching DVDs instead of going to the movie theater? It's not should or not. It's a different product sold at a different price that you get different benefits from. And what you saw way back when videos came in video stores, people said it's going to be the end of movie theaters. Well, no. What you got in that case is the same thing you get at any time technology comes into a new market. You get a market bifurcation. So half the market goes up market, same thing in art market. Art market exploded once you had digital because the value of the actual object increased. It's the same thing with universities. If MIT sold stock, I would be buying stock in MIT because the experience, and Stanford and all the rest of them, Yale too, but the experience of being in that place with those exceptional people is going to become more and more valued. That's the up market. The problem is the down market. The problem is the disintermediation. The problem is all the movie theaters that did go out of business. The problem is all the newspapers that are going out of business. And the problem is, and sounds like boosterism, this sounds like, oh, cheerleading, we're so happy about this disruptive change. I'm an economist who works on entrepreneurship and innovation. I must be thrilled, okay? Well, think about what's happened in newspapers. Think about people who you know, who were journalists, who now have found other careers, some of them good careers, okay? Newspapers don't employ a lot of people. All right, now think about universities. Think about the number of communities in this country that are built around universities. Think about the fact that those communities are, in any given county, in any given state, the most vital, the most attractive, the most desirable places to live and to be. They are the magnet for the creative people that drive the future of this country. They are built around universities. Those universities have two models, 2% growth in enrollments and 5%. They don't have a 20% decline model, right? And that model isn't going to happen next year. It's not going to happen the year after. It's going to happen with certainty in the next 10 years for at least half, if not more, of every university in this country. And that means at least half, if not more, of all those communities. So I'm here not so much saying, what a wonderful thing. It will be wonderful for the learners who have new pathways. And it will be wonderful for the country as a whole eventually. But this is a very serious challenge to the core fabric of how we organize our society. And it has to be taken as seriously as the challenge is.
Now, the opportunity, not that I've seen anything in, God forbid, 40 years of work in this field to suggest that it'll do it, but what's the biggest problem with CLEP, what you were referring to? What's the biggest problem with ACE? What's the biggest problem with servicemen's opportunity colleges? What's the biggest problem if I have a transcript from one school and I want to go to another school? People, there's no common market for academic credit. And that's because economically it paid off to be that way. So we could be virtuous and seem to be upmarket by assuming that somebody coming with that kind of learning or assessment of prior experiential learning was going to fail. So the presumption was they didn't know enough. So rather than enrolling them and finding out how they did and counseling them and talking to them, we would say, no, we're going to honor that credit at 50% or 30% or no percent, to the point where the average graduate of a public university in the United States last year in a 120 or 124 credit program had 149 credits. That's a year's worth of work. That's money. That is frustration. It's all sorts of stuff. Now, if we switch from nursing to ballet or ballet dancing to nursing, you're probably going to have to go back and take some new courses, of course. So we don't have to get silly about this analysis. But there is, in fact, the biggest pain point all of those programs have is that the receiving university won't recognize the credit. And it is a much bigger problem quantitatively than anybody, frankly, talks about. So what I would say is there is always going to be some need for to take your original question, some need for third-party validation. What is going to change, though, is that the guild or the profession supported by the university may well not be the source of that knowledge that will, and by the way, we have at least 3 lefties out of 5 people on this stage, and I want you to weigh what that means. So when a place like Straighter Line comes along, or think about what Roger Benjamin's doing at the Council for Aid to Education. You know, they've got the collegiate learning assessment, which assesses intellectual, quantitative reasoning, writing, analytical. He's got an individual collegiate learning assessment doohickey app. That would be, see, doohickey dates me in the 50s. App coming along. So now, once a year, every 6 months, I can pay him $50 and see how my skills are changing, but my intellect, my soft skills, and my ability to write, how that's changing. Well, what's that going to do, whether it's Kaplan or South Dakota State? You know, we've got to figure out how to deal with it, because I think that will be better measured and more consistent as an assessment and more available and more accessible than what almost any faculty member can do and validate based on a classroom experience. So I think the source of the validation is going to change. Cognitive task analysis, my God, we can get inside a job, we can understand it, and it isn't about who's in charge. And my point in the new ecology is the academy doesn't control the flow anymore. And when I started Community College of Vermont, I had to spend all my tactical energy on how to avoid being annihilated by the public and private colleges in the state of Vermont. Today, they do not, it doesn't matter what state you're in, they don't control the flow of this conversation or of these activities because they're in the society around them. They're not of the campus.
I want to go back to my very first question just one more time. Maybe I'll get beaten up on it one more time. But you know, until these systems change, until we have different ways to validate knowledge, and until there's an open market for credit transfer, PLA is hard, right? I mean, you wrote about a woman who is writing these 15-page essays for each credit that she's getting for her prior learning experience. So, when I ask, should we be telling people to do this? How do you weigh that against this is very difficult to do and it may not be for everyone?
Well, I think it's just really important to have it as an option because, Brianna Taravella, this particular woman, had 30 years of experience as an administrative assistant, and she had a secretarial sub-associate's degree. So to her, that's an incredible opportunity to be able to create and validate her learning, and she was willing to put her nose to the grindstone because she'd already put the work in. I mean, the work that she'd put in was not writing a 15-page essay. It was in 20 years, 25 years of learning new technologies, assimilating them and using them in a business context, developing her communication skills, being able to work in different kinds of organizations. So, prior learning assessment is a way of, it's the cherry on the sundae. It's a way of putting that learning out there in the world, and it's an incredibly validating process. It's not only externally validating, but the people that I talk to and the research that I've seen shows that it's internally extremely validating because it prompts self-reflection, metacognition, thinking about thinking. You realize how much you've accomplished. This learning that's been invisible becomes visible. So, I think, and out of all these things, I mean, people talk about a lot of this, open, technologically aware learning as being somehow less humanistic or more mechanistic or, more mechanized but credit by portfolio is not like that. I mean, it's very humanistic, it's very qualitative, it does take time. But I also think there's an incredible efficiency in it.
Yeah, and I would say, to boil that, and part of that down, reflection is the process by which you distill meaning from experience. I mean, it is learning, and so we call prior learning assessment hard work. What it is pure learning. It is the dividing or the the pulling apart of how I changed and what I learned from the mass experience of having lived in a particular year or in a particular job. I don't think it's for everybody, and I don't think we should advise it for everybody, but I think Anna's point is that what we're moving to is multiple options. You know, straighter line might not be for everybody. Something else may not be for everybody. That's, so what?
Right.
The fact is, learner choice goes way up.
Right.
And the respect that connotes for the individual, their background, their heritage, the experience they've accumulated in their life, which is fundamentally disrespected by the traditional system in these regards. And so there's much to be, I think the point is options and the respect for the person that these options connote. And clearly, if you can have someone understand the value of their journey to date in their life, however that begins. We've put it on a self-paced program with mentors and mentoring available over the phone. I think whether it's assessment or whether you can duplicate Mark Hopkins sitting on a log and do it probably better than what people who came, well, Mark Hopkins meant when he said that. So I just think it's, nothing's for everybody, and that's the point.
Just be the economist for 1 minute. Okay, so Anya's previous book was Generation Debt. Right, and one thing also we haven't brought into the discussion is just the whole fact that now student loan debt has, as of last year, exceeded the totality of credit card debt in this country, that many students are going out into a world where their job prospects are diminishing, but their debt burden is only increasing. So people are paying for this experience, and all of the idealization. I mean, I think one of the great, this is Burke Smith from Straighter Line, who says this, you know, distance learning starts in the 15th row. Okay, I mean, the universities are, who is paying the bill for all of our wonderful societal dividend that comes from universities? It's those kids, it's that kid, that one kid in the 15th row and up in the large lecture courses first and second year. That's who's paying the bill. They're subsidizing everything. That's not fair.
Yeah.
That is not fair. It's wrong. It's actually wrong. When we talk about, I mean, most of my work is actually on science-based innovation, at least, you know, that when I've thought about universities until very recently, it's been more on the research side and venture capital, angel investors, and spin-offs, and all that wonderful stuff. It is wonderful stuff. We need that stuff. But we can't have 18-year-olds paying for it when they don't even know what they're buying. It's just wrong. So all of this conversation about is desirable, options, it's not just options at, you know, at the Whole Foods. I mean, this is options at the survival level. This is options at the ruining somebody's future before they've even gotten started level. So I don't really see it as a choice. I see it as a societal imperative to make sure that these options are available and people can really advance themselves professionally without facing this sort of debt burden.
Right. I mean, I think you're right. I think that, as Peter said, you know, PLA is not for everyone, the Edupunks is not for everyone, but going to a traditional university is not for everyone either, and
Exactly.
that's thus far been the primary option that's available. But, you know, it would take sort of a pretty informed consumer to weigh these options and figure out which way to go on it. You know, for a student to do the Edupunks path, that could take them many more years, right, than it might take to attend another college.
Well, it already takes students many more years than are given in the traditional program to graduate. I mean, students are swirling, they're taking
Right.
3 and 4 times as long as the program because they have to work and they have other responsibilities. So to me, I see that as recovering that lost and wasted time. And again, like you can't compare it to an idealized experience. You have to compare it to what people are actually dealing with. And
Right.
you know, to me, I would like the Edupunks Guide to be available in every career counselor's office, every high school in the nation, because I think that students need to see that there are multiple ways to get there. And you know, it might be okay to take 6 years to get your bachelor's degree if the work that you're doing is able to be integrated back into your learning plan. If you're not rushing into college and it's just there as a social experience and you're drinking and you're not going to class, you don't need to be paying $24,000 a year for that. You can just get an apartment and just do it. So, really, like, why waste, the externalities of the university experience are are both good and bad. They can be terrible for the student when the deal overall can be terrible for the student. When our public universities are really, the proposal that Jerry Brown has signed in the University of California, students paying more of the cost of their own education out of pocket. It's no longer a public university; it's a private university. The other activities of the university are subsidized by private investment, by research grants, federal research grants, and the student basically pays for their own education up front.
Julie, I would say that I think the decline, the economic squeeze is already on, and I don't think it's going to turn around. As some of you know, at Kaplan, we now give the first 5 weeks of the first semester free, and if you can leave, or we can ask you to leave. For every one person who chooses to leave, we ask 6 to leave. And it's partly because of the perverse incentives of the financial aid system, and that's designed for 18-year-olds and just doesn't line up anything other than superbly well with the older adults, is all sorts of motivations. But that's one point. That cost us $200 million. It was also the right thing to do. When I talk to community college people, they say, well, you can do that, we can't. Not so. Second point, they get much more subsidy up front that they can hold on to, so they could actually do it and lose a far smaller fraction, but it goes entirely against the economic construction and the incentives that they have. Third point, not only Jerry Brown's, the bill he signed, but the fact that the conversation about reimbursing institutions for attainment or completion, which I think is in fact a two-edged sword. I think there's some very good ideas, things about it. There are also probably some unintended consequences. But when you look at that thinking, all of it is in play right now, depressing the amount of, wherever you're coming from, the amount of resource available to the institutions in or through the traditional model. So it isn't some future day. I mean, you've got to look across and begin to connect these dots, and it isn't just the learners. I mean, so the opportunities for the learners are multiplying like mad. At the same time, the capacity of this traditional model to actually respond to the learners is being seriously wounded. I don't think that they may not be seen collectively or seen together as reinforcing each other, but I think they're absolutely part of the same, in that case, positive-negative ecology.
Yeah, I wanted to talk just a little bit about, besides the student who's going as an edupunk and getting a degree without attending a traditional college. You also mentioned students in your book who are attending traditional universities and they're using these DIY resources to supplement or bolster that kind of education. You mentioned Mateus, and I love this one because it's the community college that was right down the street from where I grew up, so this is my favorite example. But so Mateus is attending classes at Bristol Community College, but not getting anything out of the classes, and so then using I think it's the MIT, right? The MIT open courseware and the Harvard courseware or Harvard videos to get the learning that he's not getting in the classroom, and then he just shows up to class just to be counted, just to be marked for attendance. So do we see this changing? I mean that's like kind of alarming, right? That he's literally not getting anything from the classroom experience. He's having to get it all outside of the classroom. So do we see this changing will traditional universities respond to this? Will they change how they operate?
I think they can't not. I mean, fast forward 20 years, there's a new generation of former students running higher education with a wildly different set of assumptions about what classroom instruction is, what learning is, the role of the university in knowledge creation writ large. It's going to be a whole different tool set. I think in Anya's introductory remarks, she said we can see this coming. We can, or it's almost here. We can see the seeds of it. It's absolutely every trend in distributed knowledge creation, social media use that we thought would happen someday 5 years ago is absolutely bankable now. So it can't help but remake the institutions. The question is, how much change do we want?
Right.
And how fast do we want it?
What's the answer to that question?
Well, so I know of an institution that recently did an assessment, and the assessment was of distance learning. Okay, so first of all, you have a problem because that's the language and the mentality of more than a decade ago, and we're not talking about distance learning. But anyway, the conclusion, administrative conclusion, was that this is interesting, but we think our location is still our strongest asset. And so this is the message that I have for that university administrator and all university administrators. It's not a question of whether or not your location is good. It's a question of whether it's getting better. If your location isn't getting better, then there is no reason whatsoever to think that it is going to be a strategic defense against the sort of strengths that Michael's talking about. The Smithsonian has a wonderful location. It has a superlative location. The value of its location is already capitalized into its assets. The question is the Smithsonian's location getting better? And it's not. And what the Smithsonian needs to do, just like what George Mason needs to do, just like what any university that's really subject to these challenges, and by the way, the leading universities are visioning a strategy to deploy all of their resources to make the most of their location and be leaders in online. So the leading universities get this, but it's the next tiers down that are still believing that the old competitive strengths are the ones that are going to get them through. Those competitive strengths still exist. But the question is, are they getting better? And in almost every instance, they're not.
Mark Andreessen told the newspaper industry, burn your boats.
Yeah, right.
And there's definitely, I wouldn't say it, I'm not privileged to have insider knowledge of higher ed.
Yeah.
But I imagine the same strategy, the same advice could be true in higher ed.
I mean, and the answers are really close at hand, right? Because we know what people pay for. I talk about the music industry in my presentations, and I say, if this is the iTunes U, then what are musicians going to make their money off of? Concerts. And those are because people show up to be together. And they show up to be part of something that's happening here in the here and now. And they show up to connect with people that have charisma. And this is stepping off of the concert analogy because unlike with a musician, you're not just connecting with a guy up on stage, but you actually are connecting with each other and in small groups. And so the quality of the experience that you offer, and that's part of the co-located services. What is the advantage of being in that room with other people?
And just another quick example, TED Talks was exactly the same thing. I mean, TED Talks was just a conference, and you had to pay quite a bit to get into the venue to experience TED Talks. Well, then they decided to put everything online. Well, that's going to kill TED Talks because everybody can just see it online. What it did was it just absolutely, it sent TED into the stratosphere, and the demand now to get into TED Long Beach is one of the most sought after tickets globally. And everybody can see those same talks 15 minutes after they happen or a day after.
And then they created a platform where anyone can go in their local city and
do
have their own
TEDx.
TED experience.
I think,
So brilliant.
I think the real question is, what does this all add up to, even when we don't know 95% of the moving parts because we haven't seen or they haven't been invented yet? And really what it is, in an institution to be valuable in a society has to give you something that you can't get any other way better. And we are talking about a future in which content, great teaching, the best lectures, however you want to put it, is not going to be the differentiator for 95% of all institutions. And most institutions are organized around the idea that their content and the access to their content, whatever it might be, is the critical defining differentiator. It's not going to be in the future. It already isn't, and that's what all these examples add up to. So the question is, what is it that an institution that we have historically called a college or a university, or a new kind of an institution, what value, what will they bring to the life of other people that will in fact differentiate them from something that can be gained without without assistance? And the thing is, there are a plethora of answers. I mean, there's so many answers to that question that what we're going to see, I think, to go back to your third-party your second question, the confusion that will be generated at the meta level is going to be a very significant factor. How do we know, we've had this nice orderly paradigm, and now it's just going to get, the mother of all mashups. And so it strikes me, though, that the question of what is the value I bring to this equation that can't be gained some other way that does not involve an institutional embrace of some kind. And if you can't answer that question, you're on the way out the door.
Can I ask Anya a question?
Sure.
I think in DIYU is a real eye-opener. The emperor maybe has no clothes. The emperor maybe has no clothes. The higher ed emperor maybe has no clothes. And I think Peter's assertion about the coming disorder, and maybe there was a past epoch of order, maybe isn't true. Was there a golden age of higher ed when everything sort of worked out? And I'm straw-manning Peter. I don't think he really said this. Or was it always kind of chaotic and marginally functional?
I think it's always been really messy, and it's always been a chimera. You look at it, and it's always had multiple constituents also. That's a really important part of this. It's really hard to talk about the university without talking about whose university is it. And we've kind of ping-ponged between the students' university, the professors' university, the administrators' university, the state and local governments' university. In the past, it was clergy members and members of local alumni organizations, sports teams. All these people have a stake in this crazy thing we call higher ed. So it's always been a mashup in that way. It only is in the benefit of it now disintegrating into the mist that it looked like it was so solid back then, and today it's so messy and crazy. But I think actually, this is not the first fall. If what Phil is forecasting, this is not the first die-off in American higher education. There was a massive die-off in American higher education in the early, I believe, 19th century. And then there was this massive resurgence when the federal government decided for the first time to get into, through the Morrill Act, into the creation for the first time of institutions. Beforehand, it had just been this private little activity. There might be a fall and there might be a rise again. I think it's absolutely, I would like to see the reinvention of public higher education using open models and open platforms, and the reinvestment in new kinds of models that actually have a chance of serving people's needs. So I think it's very, very important that you point that out.
And I think as with everyone here, as a co-trustee of the culture,
Yeah.
I think it influences where we put our money. Where we put the money.
Yeah.
Do we put the money on I have a friend who's a new media strategist working with a big university in town, and when they get stuck on this question, he says, sell your campus. Sell your campus. Take the Phil's heard me use this line. Sorry, buddy. Take the $4 billion in revenue you'd get, put half in the banks, take a quarter of what's left, build a new campus out in the Virginia suburbs that's built with the presumption that it's your job to be a platform, in kind of the Web 2.0 sense, and go to town.
Yeah.
I think it's always been messy, but it's always been messy behind closed doors. And now all the doors are open and the walls are down. And most of the activity is not, on the campus of the type we're talking. It's in individual people's lives. So someone will come up and say, how can you teach communities? We had a lot of service learning in Monterey Bay. How can you do that online? I said, well, do you think there's any possibility that an adult learner in an online program who lives in a community might be involved in community service, like on their own? Do you think we could maybe build some learning around that? Yeah. So the fact of the matter is, it's how you get your arms around people. And I'll give you an interesting thing that would be fun to evaluate. Is it Peter Thiel, the PayPal guy? And he's got 20 smart people. And I'll bet you that expert, I know nothing. I often say I'm occasionally wrong, but never in doubt. But the fact of the matter is, when this year is over, I'll bet you fewer than half of those people have actually produced something that is actionable in any regard. And that is a perfect example, I think, and I may have the assumptions wrong here, of where you do need to get your arms around even really bright younger people or older people, appropriate to the task that they're trying to undertake. There is a relationship that is needed. So I hope when that is over, people will seriously evaluate it, not just in terms of what magic got created, because I bet you there'll be some magic too, but what magic didn't get created, and what are the real lessons about personal or self-directed learning coming out of it?
Just to backfill, so this is Peter Thiel's Thiel Fellows Program, and he's paying people $100,000 to leave college a year.
And spend a year.
I just want to make sure that we get to audience
Sure,
questions.
yeah.
Oh,
Okay, well then let's just go to audience
Yes,
questions.
great. Yeah.
Could you just tell us your name and your organization as well?
Hi, I'm Donald Collins. I'm an adjunct associate professor at University of Maryland University College, where approximately 80% of the courses we teach are online. My question really deals with this issue of, I personally have no problems with the idea of creating alternative pathways of reaching individual students, of giving them the opportunities to take their own sort of experience to an alternative for a credential or an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree. But in listening to your conversation today, a lot of what you're talking about seems to apply to my younger students, my under 30 students. The students that I've had, the hundreds and hundreds of students I've taught over the last 4 or so years at UMUC, have really been, say, 33, 35, 40 years old. They don't have the kind of job experience that lends itself to credentialing and credits for lifelong learning. They don't have, quite frankly, they don't have the knowledge, technical knowledge really necessary to do an online course in general. I spend a lot of time just explaining to them how to use Microsoft Word and how to use, basic platforms, Wikipedia even, just to find a source. Forget about the stuff that's online at my university. I know that you're saying, well, some of this stuff is not for everybody and we just need a variety of options. But the fact of the matter is, and I know this from my own research and from other work I've done over the years, that these students, these 33-plus-year-old students, are actually the majority of students trying to go out and get degrees and credentials and so on. How do we deal with that? And by the way, I don't think that the term Edupunks would really fit my students, to be perfectly honest, but that's another story.
The less people have, the more you have to help them. If they don't have academic experience, but maybe they have, vocational experience that can be lent to it. If they have neither vocational experience nor academic experience, then the service you're trying to provide becomes that much harder. And that's absolutely the case. The changes that are taking place right now are making certain things easier, but they're not making everything easier. They're not going to completely pave the road for people that have had nothing, before. They're going to help level the playing field. They're going to bring more resources to the table, more options for people, and I mean that's really all that we can say about that. I can say about that.
yeah. And
Yeah.
I would say you're also putting your finger on the number one problem is how you support learning in any of its forms. And then when you talk about people who've been previously or are marginalized, you got that. On top of which, you've got a problem, and I know from hard experience at the Community College of Vermont, where most of the people trying to solve the problem went to the old kind of college. So they're carrying this mental model around. And I'll never forget, fresh out of Princeton and Harvard, I'm starting this community college, and I'm working with a bunch of Head Start mothers up in Barton, Vermont. And they finally, and we weren't going to have academic credit because, we're going to be like, it was going to be just cool, And this woman stood up and said, you, with your degree on the wall, are telling me I don't need one. She said, if it's good enough for you, Peter, it's good enough for me. And I'm like 24, okay?
Yeah,
and I got in my car and I said, holy moly, she's right. And so part of the thing is to bust out of the mental models that we all have.
Right.
We can identify the problems, but never underestimate the socialization power of the experience that each of us is at, and I would expect it is most of us. And you got to check yourself every day on that kind of thing. So I think that's what, in one sense, that's what you're saying, is that we're putting an overlay on things. I know in my work in California and today, the biggest problem we have is literally listening and then being useful in response to the learners, as opposed to saying, have we got a deal for you? You know, it doesn't work that way anymore.
Two questions, they're kind of combined. One, we've talked a lot about how to get the students credentialing, but the problem I had when I was running Curriki, the open source curriculum source, I was concerned about how do I get validation and credibility to the content that the students are finding and delivering, and Susan referred to that when she was in her introductory remarks. So I think there's an opportunity here to take advantage of your comment that all these small colleges around the country that are desperate for survival are looking to figure out a way to become institutions that could credential content. These people are quite bright and they're looking for it. And Altius, which is another one of the alternative schools, is actually working on that, somewhat to that model. So how do you feel about being able to get these colleges that are looking for income and revenue and a place to put these wonderful people to work and get more students? And how do you feel about this issue for validation of the content? We start making this all available for free or open, how do we know it's okay?
I mean, it's a race. The gun went off probably 3 years ago. Still, many university presidents don't know that it went off. It's a race for relevance. It's a race for market positioning. It's a race for purpose. And so, how do you succeed in this race? One of the strategies that colleges can take is they can be aggregators. They can perform that function. And the notion of college, the notion of a degree, the sense of coming to a campus is so powerful that's going to be a legacy, a competitive advantage for existing colleges for quite some time. So they can use that as serious, honest validators and brokers of content and perform that role, but in an open source, open access kind of a way. The second gets to the Peter Thiel point. It's to really deepen the experience they give to students in terms of access to networks and in terms of the opening themselves up to the broader community and really making the most of the resources that they have. And then the third is to understand what they do. I mean, Savannah School of Art and Design is a great example, right? They've found a way to be great at what they do. They do that thing. And so and we have a very diverse country, and we have a very diverse set of regional capabilities and of what can be special in a place. So if place is what matters, then understand what is it about your place that matters, and be that. And so by doing some combination of those three, those institutions that start very soon and partner in the most effective ways so that they're not doing the things that other people can do better than they can, and then focusing on what only they can do in their place, a lot of places will be successful. The most will have not 30,000, but 300,000 or 3 million students distributed globally.
My name is Karimani. I'm the founder of Mathalicious, which is rewriting middle school math around real-world topics. I had an opportunity to hear Sal Khan speak a number of years ago, and he said something really interesting. My background is in teaching. He said, one of the things that people really like about Khan Academy is that it's really informal. Sometimes I'll just start talking without knowing what I'm going to say. If you think about that, Socrates would never have said that, right? Real teaching is very intentional. Now, that's not a knock on Sal Khan. I mean, he's a hedge fund analyst turned tutor, which is very different than being a teacher. But I want to go back to something that Bobby said earlier. You said the argument now isn't about quality of content. That's not going to be the distinguishing characteristic. That's also an argument, though, for Jersey Shore being a better TV show than Frontline. So how do you, or what is our responsibility for ensuring that the stuff that's being spread is actually good? And how do we, in that marketplace, filter out kind of what's average and what's popular with what's actually effective?
Everyone's looking at me.
Yeah.
I know one of the ways it happens. I know a spectrum of ways it happens. Some happens. So at the Smithsonian, through researching and public polling and sort of virtual focus groups, we discovered that, lo and behold, the public wants our expertise. We were thinking maybe in this epoch, the public wouldn't want our expertise. They want everyone's expertise. But no, they want authority. But they don't just want authority. They want everything else as well. We did person on the street interviews out in front of our own museums. You know, what do you want from the Smithsonian Online? And people would look you right in the eye and say, we want all of your 137 million physical objects online and video in 360 degrees. And want a curator talking about each and every one of them. And I want that too. So on one end of the slider, we're going to be curating, capital C, and people want us to do that. But often in institutions, we presume that people want to learn the way we want to teach. And so that's just not true. And when we look at the other end of the slider, we want to enable people to use our trusted resources to do what they need to do, solve the problems they need to solve. And it's not up to me to decide how that community that exists now that we can find forms their system of reputation and trust, but that they do and that it's good enough for them. Are there issues of provenance of trusted materials? Are there smart things that providers of trusted information can do to make sure that people want to point back to them and want to contribute to the network effects? And there, absolutely yes. But there's a spectrum of activities, and I think we're stepping away from thinking we need to control it all. That's just one way.
And what I'm in, I mean, I'm pretty close to the MIT Open Courseware project because I've been on their advisory board since it started. And what I mean by when I say that is that 5-7 years from now, if not right now, there are going to be fabulous examples of courseware that are well provenanced, that are going to be available to anybody who wants to use them. You could, in fact, start a college around the free MIT material tomorrow.
And it's been done.
Yeah.
It's
No. Okay. So the point of the matter, that's what I meant. And I think the other piece that is lying underneath this as an educator, I would say, is that we really are, and you touched on this, Anya, I think we're redefining what it means to be smart, or it may have been one of the other speakers. But think about it. Being successful in school is fun, and failing hurts. And so the whole notion is to avoid pain, if you think about it one way. As opposed to saying to somebody, learning is an engaged, it's hard activity. It's okay to not know something. And it's a message that we fail to give. People deal with it every day in their adult learning, personal learning lives. They deal with things they don't know and the struggle to learn, but it's private. School makes it public. And so the whole notion that being smart doesn't mean you already know what you're expected to show at the end of the day. Being smart means that you're capable of getting your arms around it with some help and proceeding towards a destination. And to me, that's where the magic and all the juicy stuff that we're, I think, sort of talking about and around and under and over here, because we don't quite have the language for it yet, is one of the big changes educationally is that we're not confusing smart with knowing it before somebody said it to you. You know, smart is something else now, and it's very confusing to people who play the hierarchical game. It's very confusing.
This is good.
I just want to, I don't want to hold up the questions, but I just want to add one more thing to what you're saying there, because I think it's an interesting point that your question brings up. That I was speaking to somebody yesterday about their open coursework and the conversation about whether the content that's delivered online is the textbook or the teacher. And I think that that's something that we're trying to figure out. Is it just content that you then need a teacher to help translate, or is it replacing the teacher itself?
Yep.
While the mic's going around, I'll plug an event this afternoon. If you want to hear more of Anya, she'll be speaking, giving a free talk at the Smithsonian at 1:30 this afternoon at the Baird Auditorium. So please join us. It'll be all Anya.
It'll also be webcast, so you can
Yes.
tell people about it.
And DIYU is well worth reading. I think we will all agree that.
Amen.
With Corporate Voices for Working Families, and I really appreciate this conversation more than I can say. I want to push back to something that Phil brought up, which is that our students are out there, our learners are out there as brokers of credentials that they obtain, and they're really reselling them to their employers. That's who's actually buying it. You said that. And I don't know how you have this conversation without including your employer partners. And you're going to end up creating exactly what you're talking about. Large employers, large corporations with the ability to do so are already getting what they need. They know how to do it. They assess people. A credential doesn't necessarily, a degree doesn't mean it, but they figure out how to get what they need. And we've got to figure out how to then offer that same opportunity below that. And Julie asked the question 3 times and it still hasn't been answered, is how do you take that opportunity to get a credential and pass it down to that middle worker and small, that's being hired by that middle employer and small employer that doesn't have the ability to do what the elite companies do. Just like the elite higher ed is going to go on. They're going to do what they do. So making it more democratic.
Well, I mean, so the small employers aren't able to hire that many Stanford, MIT, MBAs anyway. So they're in a different market. And I think everything that we're talking about democratizes the marketplace from the standpoint of the purchaser, just as it in the labor market, as much as it does for the seller. So to the extent that Mozilla badges become understood as a kind of a marker of capabilities, or even, like you say, a Microsoft certificate, of which there are 2 million, Anya found out via Twitter last night. That was interesting information. Or a Cisco certificate. I mean, small business uses those markers. The International Standards Organization has a long-standing program of certification, assessment, and accreditation that they are now ramping up to a system of stacked certificates. If you want to track something that's truly disruptive, track that, because universities aren't at the table in those conversations. It's industry is at the table. Once that's going to encroach on the current role of universities. Again, that's something that go ahead. Yeah. What is it?
My point exactly is that corporations that are doing this should be in this conversation and they should be emulating.
Well, no, I totally agree. I mean, when I held the event that I did with George Mason and Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, co-hosted a year and a half ago, where Anya and Mike both spoke, the first speaker was from Manpower, Inc. And the reason we had Manpower, Inc. was because they represent global industry in 160 countries. But I just want to offer up one other disruptive example, okay? Just came across yesterday, again on Twitter. A couple of companies that are exploring extending credit based on Clout scores. Clout scores, as your sort of aggregated social. So Clout isn't necessarily the right way to do it, but if you interact Clout and Mozilla badges, I mean, you want to talk about a broken system, you can talk about consumer lending in this country. We've been talking about financing, but this is a whole nother disruption that can be worked on top of all of the things we're talking about. It's not actually just universities. So it's democratizing in all sorts of dimensions, and I think it's going to be at least as good for small businesses as for corporations.
And just to be absolutely rudimentary about it, right now, whether you use, I don't know if Learning Counts, they could do this operationally, or what we do or what others do, you could go into a business of any size and do a diagnosis of what it is people know and how they learned it and what it's worth, and use the workplace as a place of learning, period. You can do it right now. The question is finding people and legitimizing it, because when we did market studies on assessment of prior learning, the biggest problem we had was convincing people who had not been to college or had not been successful in college that it was okay to trust and to work to pull the learning out of themselves. Once they got it, they went all the way over to the other side. The needle went all the way over to 98%. But in the beginning, in these focus groups, people were saying, that sounds a little cheesy to me. I mean, because we've socialized people to believe that if it didn't happen in a classroom, it isn't worth a dime.
Exactly.
And so that's where we've got to work. And that is an employer problem as well as an employee problem. they're all carrying their own mental models around. But you're right. They're part of our conversation, I can tell you that.
Well, so I agree with you. It took me a while, but I figured out what you said.
I'm gonna end right there just because, you know, I was always that student in class who hated when things went overtime, but our panelists will be around to answer more questions. Thank you.